In the bustling city of Greenborough, inequality was an everyday reality. While towering skyscrapers reflected the success of a privileged few, the dimly lit alleys hid the harsh struggles of the many. David Carter, a seasoned detective in the Violent Crimes Special Unit, was a man who understood both sides of this coin. Born to hard-working parents in a struggling neighborhood, he had climbed his way up through determination, but life had left its marks on him. Recently divorced, David carried the weight of an empty home and an exhausting routine that consumed him. Work was his only constant, a lifeline in the emotional chaos. Tuesday morning began like many others, with the crackle of the police radio filling the car. But the next call was different. A major operation was underway at Bella Vista, a high-end restaurant frequented by politicians and influential businessmen, now under investigation for money laundering. Arriving at the scene, David and his team found an atmosphere charged with quiet tension. The restaurant was a spectacle of extravagance: perfectly set tables, grand chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, and marble walls that gleamed under soft lighting. Patrons in their finest attire looked on with apprehension as officers moved through the space, questioning staff and inspecting records. While cross-checking a list of suspects, David noticed a striking woman. Seated alone in a corner, she stood out not just for her beauty, but for the calm confidence she exuded, in stark contrast to the nervous energy of the room. Her dark skin glowed under the restaurant's lights, and her tailored red dress fit her like a second skin. She had a phone in hand, but seemed to be observing everything around her with quiet intent. David approached carefully. "Ma'am, may I ask you a few questions?" he said, as the woman looked up with a mixture of curiosity and boldness. "Of course, officer. How can I help?" she replied, her voice smooth and steady, catching him slightly off guard. He began with routine questions: her name, the reason for her visit, and her connection to the restaurant's owners. She answered everything precisely and calmly, but something about her demeanor felt more rehearsed than casual. Then, in a fleeting moment of distraction, as David reached for the ID she was offering, his hand grazed her chest. It was a mistake, a fraction of a second that felt like it froze time. His face instantly flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, that wasn't my intention," he began, but the woman cut him off with an enigmatic smile. "It's fine, officer. It happens." Her words were brief, but her tone carried an intrigue that lingered. Unease settled over David like a weight he couldn't shake. The sensation of crossing a line, even unintentionally, stayed with him as he walked away to continue his work. Hours later, back at the precinct, David found a brown envelope on his desk. There was no sender, just his name hastily scrawled across the front. Opening it, he felt a chill run down his spine. Inside was a photo captured at Bella Vista earlier that day. It showed him clearly, caught in the exact moment his hand touched the woman's chest. The image was sharp and well-framed, as though taken with the intention of incriminating him. There was no note, no explanation, just the photo. David's stomach turned. Who had taken this picture? And more importantly, why? He ran a hand through his hair, trying to process, but before he could think further, his phone buzzed. It was his boss, Captain Michael Gallagher, summoning him to a meeting. Gallagher's tone was curt, as always, giving away nothing more than his usual impatience. David headed to the captain's office, the envelope tucked discreetly under his arm. What he didn't know was that the woman from the restaurant, Sarah Gallagher, wasn't just any patron. She was the captain's wife, and at that very moment, she sat at home, scrolling through her phone with a satisfied smile that spoke louder than words. In the meeting room, Gallagher stood waiting, his expression unreadable. "Carter, you know I've always trusted you, but something big is brewing. I need you to stay sharp. The Bella Vista case involves powerful people, and we can't afford to slip up." The captain appeared oblivious to the incident with Sarah, but David's gut told him something was very wrong. The clock in the captain's office read 6 p.m. when David finally left, the envelope still hidden in his jacket pocket. As he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced around, but the street was empty. Only the shadows of buildings danced under the streetlights. A shiver crawled down his spine. Something told him this was just the beginning. Greenborough was a city of contradictions. Gleaming high-rises stretched toward the sky, symbols of wealth and ambition, while just blocks away, neighborhoods crumbled under the weight of neglect. These were the places David Carter knew well, the streets where he'd grown up, and where survival had been as much about wits as hard work. As a detective, he prided himself on bridging the gap, seeking justice for victims who often felt abandoned by a system designed to cater to the elite. The Bella Vista case had exposed just how deep those divides ran. For years, whispers of corruption and backroom deals swirled around the restaurant, but nothing stuck. It wasn't just a place to dine. It was a fortress for the city's movers and shakers. The investigation was a rare chance to shine a light on the shadowy network that connected Greenborough's upper echelons. As David dug into the case, he couldn't shake the image of Sarah Gallagher, the mysterious woman from the restaurant. Her face lingered in his mind, not just for its striking beauty, but for the aura of control she exuded. Something about her didn't add up. Why would someone like her, polished and poised, choose to dine alone in a place under federal scrutiny? But David wasn't the only one wrestling with questions. Sarah, too, had her own reasons for being at Bella Vista. As the wife of Captain Michael Gallagher, she was no stranger to the world of power plays and unspoken alliances. Her marriage, however, was far from the fairy tale it appeared to be. Beneath the polished veneer lay a union marked by control and resentment. Michael's temper was legendary, his expectations rigid. For years, Sarah had played her part, smiling at fundraisers and keeping his secrets, but cracks were forming in the facade. David spent the next few days poring over documents seized from the restaurant, working late into the night. The photo from the envelope remained tucked in his desk drawer, a constant reminder of the invisible threat hanging over him. Was someone trying to blackmail him? Or was this a warning? His partner, Detective Maria Lopez, noticed his distracted demeanor. Maria was sharp, with a dry sense of humor that often lightened the tension of their job. "You've been quiet, Carter. Something eating at you?" she asked, leaning against the edge of his desk. David hesitated. Sharing the photo felt risky, but he trusted Maria. Lowering his voice, he slid the envelope across the desk. "This showed up on my desk a few days ago." Maria's brow furrowed as she studied the photo. "This is bad," she said, her tone serious. "But it's not incriminating. You didn't do anything wrong. Try telling that to whoever sent it, or to the captain, if this gets out," David replied. "I don't even know who took it or why." Maria leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've both been on enough cases to know how this works. Someone's playing a long game, and you're part of it. Be careful, David. Whoever's behind this isn't just watching, they're planning." Meanwhile, Sarah was plotting her next move. The restaurant visit had been deliberate, a carefully orchestrated act to bait David. She'd sensed his unease, and the photo was just the first step in a larger scheme. She had her reasons, ones that went beyond mere manipulation. Michael Gallagher was a man of many faces. To the public, he was a disciplined leader who commanded respect. At home, he was a tyrant, his anger unpredictable and often explosive. Sarah had endured years of his control, but she was no victim. She had learned to navigate his moods, to anticipate his moves, and to gather leverage. And now she saw an opportunity to use David. The dinner at Bella Vista hadn't been her idea. Michael had arranged it, a last-minute change to their usual routine. When she arrived early, she recognized several faces: politicians, business owners, people who owed their success to Michael's influence. But one man stood out: Detective David Carter. Sarah had heard his name before, always spoken with respect. He was one of the few in Michael's department who didn't play politics. Her encounter with David was meant to test him, to gauge his reaction under pressure. The accidental touch had been a stroke of luck, one she exploited with a subtle smile and a mental note. When the photo arrived in David's office, Sarah was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Back at the precinct, the investigation into Bella Vista was stalling. Witnesses were clamming up, and critical evidence seemed to vanish before it could be analyzed. David and Maria hit roadblock after roadblock, but they knew better than to chalk it up to coincidence. Someone powerful was pulling strings. Late one evening, as David reviewed the case files, an unexpected call came in. The voice on the other end was distorted, the words deliberate. "Detective Carter, you're in over your head. Leave the Bella Vista case, or that photo won't be the last thing you'll have to worry about." David's blood ran cold. The line went dead before he could respond. He sat back, the phone still in his hand, heart pounding. The stakes had just been raised. The call was a turning point. David sat in the dimly lit precinct, staring at the case files strewn across his desk. His mind raced with possibilities. Who had sent the photo? Who was behind the threatening call? And how were they connected to Bella Vista? Every instinct told him that dropping the case wasn't an option. The stakes were higher than ever, but backing down would mean surrendering to the very corruption he'd spent his career fighting. The following day, David and Maria regrouped. The precinct was buzzing with activity, but they found a quiet corner to strategize. The call, what exactly did they say? Maria asked, her voice hushed. "Leave the case or else," David replied, running a hand through his hair. Classic intimidation. "But if they think that's enough to scare me off, they don't know me." Maria gave him a pointed look. "David, this isn't just about you. Whoever's behind this has resources. We're dealing with people who can make evidence disappear and witnesses go silent. If they wanted to, they could ruin more than your career." He nodded. "I know, but if we back off, we're letting them win. We need to dig deeper, find out who's really pulling the strings." They decided to focus on the financial records retrieved from Bella Vista, hoping they might uncover a trail of dirty money that could lead to the mastermind. But the deeper they delved, the more obstacles they encountered. Key documents were missing, and digital files were corrupted. Every step forward seemed to come with 2 steps back. While David and Maria scrambled for leads, Sarah Gallagher continued her careful maneuvering. She had spent years cultivating her image, a trophy wife who smiled at the right moments and knew when to keep quiet. But behind the scenes, she was playing a dangerous game of her own. Her marriage to Michael had long been a strategic alliance. What started as love had withered into resentment, buried under layers of control and expectation. Now, she saw an opportunity to reclaim power. She had spent years gathering information about Michael's dealings, and Bella Vista was at the center of it all. That evening, Sarah called an old acquaintance, a journalist she trusted from her pre-marriage days, someone who specialized in exposing corruption. "I have a story," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "But you'll need to tread carefully. The people involved won't hesitate to bury this, or you, if it gets out." The journalist, intrigued, agreed to meet her the next day. Sarah hung up, knowing she was risking everything. But for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. Back at the precinct, David and Maria finally caught a break. A forensic analyst managed to recover fragments of an encrypted file from Bella Vista's servers. The data included names, dates, and coded transactions that pointed to a network of offshore accounts. Among the names was one that stood out: Michael Gallagher. David's stomach dropped. His captain wasn't just tangentially involved, he was central to the operation. This was the leverage someone had been using to try to silence him. "This can't be a coincidence," he muttered. Michael's connection to Bella Vista, the photo, the call, it's all connected. Maria looked equally stunned. "If we go after him, we need airtight evidence. You know how this will play out if we don't." David nodded. "Then we start building the case." Quietly, that night, David returned home, exhausted but unable to shake the feeling of being watched. As he locked his front door, his phone buzzed. This time, it was a text message. The sender was anonymous. The words brief: "Stop digging." Last warning. David scanned the street outside his window, but saw nothing unusual. Whoever was behind this had eyes everywhere. He forwarded the message to Maria and poured himself a stiff drink. Sleep wouldn't come easily that night. The next day, Sarah met the journalist in a discreet cafe on the city's outskirts. She arrived early, wearing sunglasses and a scarf that obscured her features. The journalist, a weary man in his 40s named Ethan, slid into the booth across from her. "Sarah Gallagher," he said, a hint of surprise in his tone. I didn't expect you to be the source. I don't care what you expected, Sarah replied curtly. Do you want the story or not? Ethan leaned forward. What do you have? Sarah handed him a USB drive, enough to bring down Michael Gallagher and everyone connected to him. But you have to be smart. If you leak this the wrong way, they'll crush you and me. Ethan studied her, then pocketed the drive. I'll be in touch. As Sarah left the cafe, she felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. The wheels were in motion, but there was no turning back. At the precinct, David and Maria worked tirelessly to untangle the financial web. But time was running out. The photo, the calls, the mounting pressure, it all pointed to a coordinated effort to shut them down. Maria glanced at David as they pored over the latest documents. You realize we're not just dealing with corrupt cops or businessmen. This is a full-blown conspiracy. David nodded grimly. And it's only a matter of time before they make their next move. The walls around David seemed to close in with each passing day. As he and Maria dug deeper, the threads of the Bella Vista case intertwined with hidden motives, secret alliances, and dangerous players. The investigation felt less like peeling back layers of corruption and more like walking into a trap. Every step forward revealed how much they didn't know and how many people were working to keep it that way. Sarah Gallagher felt the tension in her chest as she watched Michael leave for work that morning. He kissed her cheek out of habit, a hollow gesture that no longer held meaning. She maintained her smile until the door closed behind him, then let out a shaky breath. She knew it wouldn't be long before her actions came to light. The USB drive she had given to Ethan contained damning evidence, financial records, emails, and even a recording of a heated conversation between Michael and one of his associates. But it wasn't just about exposing Michael. It was about taking control of her life. Yet, Sarah wasn't naive. She knew the risks. Michael was unpredictable, and if he discovered her betrayal, his wrath would be swift and merciless. That morning, she made her own preparations, ensuring that if things went south, she'd have an escape plan. In the precinct's evidence room, David and Maria pored over the fragmented data they'd recovered from Bella Vista's servers. Their focus paid off when they found a pattern in the coded transactions. Several payments, disguised as consulting fees, led to the same offshore account. Cross-referencing the names revealed connections to prominent figures in the city, including Michael Gallagher. This ties Michael directly to the money laundering, Maria said, her voice low but urgent. If we can confirm this, we'll have enough to bring him in. David felt the weight of her words. Taking down their captain wasn't just a professional risk, it was personal. Michael had mentored him early in his career, shaping him into the officer he was today. But the evidence was undeniable. We can't act yet, David said. We need to keep building the case. If we move too soon, they'll bury this and us. Maria nodded reluctantly. We need to keep this quiet. If Michael catches wind of what we're doing. David didn't need her to finish the sentence. They both knew what was at stake. Ethan sat in his cramped apartment, scrolling through the files Sarah had given him. Each document was more damning than the last. He was no stranger to dangerous stories, but this one was different. It wasn't just about corruption, it was about power, control, and the lengths people would go to protect their secrets. He hesitated. Publishing the story would make waves, but it would also make him a target. Still, Sarah's courage inspired him. She was risking everything to bring this to light. How could he do any less? Ethan picked up his phone and made a call. I have a story, he said, but I'll need protection before it goes live. Unbeknownst to David, Michael was beginning to sense the unrest in his unit. The whispers of discontent, the uncharacteristic secrecy among his officers, it all pointed to trouble. That evening, he convened a meeting with his closest allies, men he trusted to enforce his will without question. We have a problem, Michael said, his tone cold and calculating. Someone's digging where they shouldn't. I want names, and I want them yesterday. His allies exchanged nervous glances, but none dared challenge him. Michael's reputation for ruthlessness was well earned, and no one in the room wanted to be on the receiving end of his wrath. Sarah's calm exterior began to crack as the days passed. Michael grew more paranoid, and his behavior at home turned erratic. He questioned her more often, his tone sharp and suspicious. One evening, after a tense dinner, he cornered her in the living room. "Where were you the other day?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah kept her expression neutral. "I told you I had errands to run." Michael studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. "You've been acting different lately. If there's something you're not telling me." "There's nothing," she said, cutting him off before he could finish. "I've been stressed, that's all." "You're imagining things." Michael didn't respond, but his gaze lingered, heavy with unspoken doubt. Sarah held her breath as he finally turned and walked away, but she knew it was only a matter of time before his suspicions boiled over. Desperation pushed David to take a risk he normally wouldn't consider. Late one night, he parked outside Michael's house, watching the darkened windows. He needed to know if his captain was aware of their investigation. He had no concrete plan, just an overwhelming need for answers. Suddenly, a light flickered on inside. David ducked lower in his seat, his heart pounding. Through the living room window, he saw Michael pacing, phone pressed to his ear. David couldn't hear the conversation, but Michael's body language spoke volumes. Sharp gestures, clenched fists, and a scowl etched deep into his face. The light went out as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving David alone in the dark. He started his car and drove away, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on him. He couldn't afford to slip up now. The next morning, Maria received an envelope on her desk similar to the one David had received. Inside was a single photo of the two of them, sitting together at a coffee shop, their heads close as they discussed the case. On the back, a note read, "You've been warned." Maria slammed the envelope down in frustration. "They're watching us, David. Everywhere we go, everything we do, they're a step ahead." David clenched his fists. "Then it's time we stop playing defense." The tension boiled over 2 days later. David and Maria had uncovered enough evidence to implicate Michael Gallagher and his network in the Bella Vista money laundering operation. Their progress, however, hadn't gone unnoticed. The precinct, once a place of camaraderie and purpose, now felt like a minefield. Every glance, every whispered conversation carried the weight of suspicion. David's gut told him they were running out of time. He couldn't shake the feeling that their moves were being anticipated. That morning, he decided to take a drastic step. David found himself standing outside Michael's office, the folder of evidence in his hands. He knew confronting his captain directly was reckless, but the alternative, letting someone else leak the information and losing control of the narrative, was worse. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. "Come in," Michael's gruff voice barked. David entered, his eyes locking onto Michael's. The captain leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Carter, what brings you here?" David placed the folder on the desk. "This." Michael opened the folder and flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each document. After a tense silence, he closed it and leaned forward. "You've been busy." "I had to be," David replied, keeping his voice steady. "You've been covering for Bella Vista. The payments, the offshore accounts, the connections to the precinct, it all points to you." Michael's face twisted into a mocking smile. "And what do you think you're going to do with this?" "I'm giving you a chance to come clean," David said. "Turn yourself in, cooperate with the investigation. It's the only way this ends without more damage." Michael's laughter was cold and sharp. "You think you're a hero, don't you? But you're nothing, Carter. A cog in a machine you don't understand. Do you know how deep this goes? How many people are involved? If you try to take me down, they'll bury you before you even get close." David held his ground. "We'll see about that." Michael's tone shifted, laced with menace. "You're playing a dangerous game, Carter. Watch your back." Meanwhile, Sarah was preparing for her own showdown. Ethan, the journalist, had published a teaser of the story, a cryptic headline that hinted at corruption in the Greenborough PD without naming names. The response was immediate. Sarah's phone lit up with calls and messages, but she ignored them all. She knew the full story would hit the next day, and there would be no turning back. That evening, as Michael returned home, she confronted him. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but firm. Michael froze in the doorway, his instinct sharp. What about? Sarah stepped closer. Bella Vista, the accounts, everything. It's over, Michael. His eyes narrowed. What did you do? I told the truth, she said, her voice unwavering. For once, I stopped letting you control me. Michael's fury erupted. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight and punishing. Do you have any idea what you've done? Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Yes, and I'd do it again. For a moment, it seemed he might strike her, but something held him back. Instead, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Sarah collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling but her resolve intact. She had played her part. Now it was up to David and Ethan to finish the job. The next morning, Greenborough woke to the full story splashed across the headlines. Ethan had spared no details, naming names and laying out the entire operation. Michael Gallagher's involvement was front and center, along with connections to city officials and local business leaders. The precinct descended into chaos. Officers whispered in corners, phones rang off the hook, and reporters swarmed outside. Michael's absence only fueled the fire. By midday, an arrest warrant had been issued for him, but he was nowhere to be found. David and Maria worked furiously to track his movements. Every lead seemed to end in a dead end, but David's instincts led him to the one place Michael might go, the Bella Vista restaurant. That evening, David arrived at Bella Vista alone. The restaurant was dark, its doors locked, but a faint light glowed from the office upstairs. Drawing his weapon, he entered cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He found Michael in the office, frantically shredding documents. It's over, Captain, David said, his voice firm. There's nowhere left to run. Michael turned, his face a mask of defiance. You think you've won? You think taking me down will change anything? This city was built on deals like this. David stepped closer, his gun steady. Maybe not, but it's a start. For a tense moment, neither man moved. Then, with a resigned sigh, Michael raised his hands. You're a fool, Carter. You don't see the big picture. David cuffed him, ignoring the captain's final taunts. As he led Michael out of the building, the weight on his shoulders began to lift. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in months, he felt like he'd struck a blow against the corruption that had plagued Greenborough. The arrest of Captain Michael Gallagher sent shockwaves through Greenborough. As news of his crime spread, the city's already fragile trust in law enforcement crumbled further. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, holding signs that demanded accountability and justice. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, officers divided between disbelief and betrayal. David Carter, now reluctantly thrust into the spotlight, struggled with the fallout. His role in exposing Gallagher made him a hero to some and a traitor to others. He knew the implications of his actions extended beyond the arrest. The web of corruption Gallagher had maintained for years was vast, and dismantling it would take more than a single takedown. Maria Lopez, steadfast as ever, stood by David's side as they faced mounting challenges. The evidence they had gathered implicated more than just Gallagher. Several high-ranking officials and business leaders were tied to the scandal. But the revelations came with a cost. Threats poured in daily, ranging from anonymous calls to ominous letters slipped under their office doors. You think it's worth it? Maria asked one evening as they sifted through yet another stack of files. All this chaos, all this backlash? David leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched on his face. It has to be. If we don't see this through, who will? Maria nodded, her respect for her partner growing. Then we keep going. No matter what, for Sarah Gallagher, life had irrevocably changed. Michael's arrest freed her from years of manipulation and control, but it also left her exposed. The media descended on her like vultures, digging into every aspect of her life. Reporters camped outside her home, speculating about her role in her husband's schemes. Ethan, the journalist who had published the story, reached out to her with a promise to tell her side of the story. Initially reluctant, Sarah eventually agreed. Sitting across from him in a quiet studio, she recounted her experiences with a mix of vulnerability and defiance. Michael controlled everything, she said, but I learned to adapt. to survive. And when I saw an opportunity to break free, I took it." Her words resonated with readers and viewers across the city. Sarah's bravery became a symbol of resistance, inspiring others to come forward with their own stories of corruption and abuse. As the investigation into Bella Vista and Gallagher's network deepened, David and Maria uncovered even more shocking truths. Gallagher had been a linchpin in a sprawling operation that included drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and money laundering. The scope of the corruption was staggering, implicating figures in law enforcement, politics, and business. But with every revelation came new dangers. One night, as David drove home, his car was forced off the road by a black SUV. The crash left him shaken but uninjured, a clear message that his enemies were escalating their tactics. "They're scared," Maria said when she visited him in the hospital. "And scared people make mistakes." David's resolve hardened. "Then we'll use that to our advantage." Despite the chaos, small victories began to emerge. Several of Gallagher's associates were arrested, and their cooperation led to the recovery of millions in laundered funds. Community leaders and activists rallied to rebuild trust in the police, pushing for reforms that promised greater accountability. David played a key role in these efforts, meeting with local organizations and listening to their concerns. While many remained skeptical, his sincerity won over some hearts and minds. He knew that repairing the damage would take time, but every step forward felt like progress. With Michael behind bars, Sarah began to rebuild her life. She sold their opulent home and moved into a modest apartment, finding solace in the simplicity she had long been denied. She also started working with a nonprofit that supported survivors of domestic abuse, using her platform to advocate for those who couldn't speak for themselves. One day, she received an anonymous letter in the mail. Inside was a single sentence: "You did what we couldn't." It was unsigned, but the message brought tears to her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose. Late one evening, David returned to Bella Vista, now shuttered and abandoned. He stood outside, staring at the darkened windows, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The restaurant had been the epicenter of a storm, but it was also where his path had crossed with Sarah's, a meeting that changed the course of both their lives. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Maria. "We got him." "Another arrest. See you tomorrow." David smiled faintly. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like they were winning. The case against Michael Gallagher culminated in a high-stakes trial that gripped Greenborough. Prosecutors laid out a damning case, detailing his role in the Bella Vista operation and exposing the extensive network of corruption he had built. Every revelation sent shockwaves through the city, implicating more officials and eroding what little trust remained in its institutions. David and Maria played pivotal roles in the proceedings. Their testimonies, bolstered by the evidence they had painstakingly gathered, painted a vivid picture of Gallagher's web of deceit. The trial was as much a test of their resolve as it was of Gallagher's guilt. Every cross-examination felt like a battle, the defense team relentless in their attempts to discredit them. Sarah Gallagher's appearance in court was the most anticipated moment of the trial. When she took the stand, the room fell silent. Wearing a simple black dress, she radiated a quiet strength that commanded attention. "Mrs. Gallagher," the prosecutor began, "can you describe your husband's involvement in the Bella Vista operation?" Sarah took a deep breath, her voice steady, as she recounted years of manipulation, coercion, and complicity. She didn't paint herself as a victim, nor did she shy away from her own complicity in covering for Michael's actions. "I stayed silent because I was afraid," she admitted. "But silence makes you complicit. When I realized what I was enabling, I knew I had to act." Her testimony was a turning point, offering an insider's perspective that dismantled the defense's narrative. Michael sat stone-faced throughout, his eyes never leaving hers. For Sarah, it was both an act of liberation and a final reckoning. As the trial entered its final days, the prosecution presented its closing argument, a video of Michael Gallagher caught in an unguarded moment. The footage, secretly recorded by one of his former associates, captured him admitting to laundering money through Bella Vista and mocking the very system he had sworn to uphold. The courtroom erupted. The evidence was undeniable, sealing Michael's fate. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentencing was swift and severe. Michael Gallagher was given a life sentence without parole, a symbol of the city's commitment to rooting out corruption. The verdict marked the end of an era and the beginning of a long road to recovery for Greenborough. For David Carter, the trial's conclusion brought mixed emotions. He had fought tirelessly for justice, but the cost had been high. Relationships within the precinct were fractured, and the trust of the public remained tenuous. Yet, as he watched Gallagher being led away in handcuffs, he felt a sense of closure. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him and Maria, shouting questions about the case and their plans moving forward. David paused, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't just about one man," he said. "It's about rebuilding trust in our city and holding everyone accountable, myself included. We have a lot of work to do, but today is a step in the right direction." With Michael behind bars, Sarah began to rebuild her life on her own terms. She became a vocal advocate for systemic reform, using her platform to challenge the culture of silence and complicity that had allowed Michael's crimes to flourish. Her story became a beacon of hope for others trapped in similar circumstances. One evening, as she walked through the city's bustling streets, she passed a mural painted on a brick wall. It depicted a phoenix rising from the ashes, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray cityscape. Sarah paused, feeling a surge of determination. Greenborough was changing, and she was determined to be part of that transformation. Months later, David found himself back at Bella Vista. The restaurant had been gutted, its once opulent interior reduced to bare walls and broken glass. Standing in the empty space, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here, the risks he'd taken, the sacrifices he'd made, and the lives that had been changed. Maria joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Can't believe this place is still standing," she said, handing him a cup. David smirked. Barely. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experiences unspoken but understood. Finally, Maria broke the silence. "So, what's next?" David took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. "We keep going. There's still work to do." The aftermath of the Gallagher trial marked a turning point for Greenborough. The city, once overshadowed by corruption, began its slow march toward redemption. Initiatives for police reform gained momentum, driven by public demand and supported by voices like David Carter and Sarah Gallagher. While the scars of the past remained visible, there was a growing sense of hope that change was possible. For David, the weeks following the trial were a blur of interviews, meetings, and reflection. His decision to expose Michael Gallagher had earned him respect from the public, but strained relationships within the precinct. Some officers viewed him as a traitor, while others quietly expressed their admiration. Despite the mixed reception, David remained steadfast in his belief that integrity was worth the cost. He continued his work in the Violent Crimes Unit, though his role had evolved. He became a mentor to younger officers, teaching them to prioritize justice over politics and to value the communities they served. One day, as he sat at his desk reviewing a case file, Maria approached with a small envelope. "You've got mail," she said with a smirk. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for your courage. Because of you, my family can finally believe in justice again." A grateful citizen, David read the note twice, his chest tightening with emotion. It was a reminder of why he had chosen this path and why he would continue to walk it, no matter how difficult. Sarah Gallagher's journey of self-reclamation continued to inspire others. She published a memoir titled Behind Closed Doors, detailing her experiences with Michael and the events leading to his downfall. The book became a bestseller, sparking conversations about power dynamics, domestic abuse, and systemic corruption. Sarah also threw herself into advocacy work, partnering with nonprofits to support victims of abuse and corruption. Her efforts earned her recognition as a symbol of resilience and change. Though the scars of her past lingered, she found strength in her ability to transform her pain into purpose. One evening, after a speaking engagement, Sarah stood on the balcony of her modest apartment, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. She had taken control of her life, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she was ready for whatever came next. The city began to heal in small but meaningful ways. The Bella Vista building, once a symbol of corruption, was transformed into a community center. Murals adorned its walls, painted by local artists, and celebrating the resilience of the people. While challenges remained, the efforts of people like David and Sarah proved that change was possible. Trust in law enforcement slowly improved as reforms took root, and citizens became more engaged in holding their leaders accountable. Months later, David and Sarah crossed paths at a public event commemorating the opening of the Bella Vista Community Center. The air was filled with laughter and music as families gathered to celebrate the occasion. David spotted Sarah standing near one of the murals, a soft smile on her face. He approached, unsure of what to say. "It's good to see you," he said finally. Sarah turned to him, her smile widening. "You too. Looks like Greenborough's starting to find its way." David nodded, looking around at the bustling crowd. "Thanks to people like you," Sarah chuckled. "I think we both had a hand in it." They stood in companionable silence for a moment before parting ways, each feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Years later, Greenborough became a case study in resilience and reform, its story taught in law schools and public policy programs across the country. David Carter and Sarah Gallagher remained symbols of the city's transformation, proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, individuals could make a difference. As the city continued to evolve, their actions served as a reminder of the power of courage and integrity. Greenborough's shadows might never fully disappear, but its future now shimmered with the promise of light. What did you think of The Secret of the Chief's Wife? Share your thoughts on how courage and integrity can challenge corruption and inspire change. Let this story spark conversations in your own community about the power of accountability and the importance of standing up for what's right.